Concept development, moving from macro to micro research to identify trend stories and compiling a digital image collective. So let's recap on what we've done so far. We've analysed trends and things in store currently with our partners and competitors. We're always ongoing with our fashion scans, seeing what's happening out and about with various different retailers, scanning print, broadcast and online sources, as well as hopefully networking with people in the creative industries. We've looked at cultural indicators by doing our pastel analysis, and we've completed a consumer scan and created consumer profiles from that. With all this information combined, we can now go on to do our fashion analysis and trend analysis, which will allow us to start creating our trend stories for forecasting. And again, competitor analysis is always ongoing. You should be doing this all the time anyway. So what information do you have to analyse so far? You have your pastel analysis. You should be aware of what's happening in society at the moment and be able to make predictions of how these scenarios may develop. You've got your consumer information, understanding of your consumer profiles, and know who you will be targeting your trends at. And you also have your competitor analysis. Make sure you're offering newness in comparison to your competitors and you're able to keep one step ahead of them, hopefully at the same time. So how do you translate a pastel analysis into trend predictions? Well, let's take a look. So here's an extract from one of my pastel analysis from recently. I'm looking here specifically at my social and cultural board. I pulled together lots of news stories that I think fit into this, and then starting to delve deeper into the issues that I think will affect my target market. The first one being is a move towards homeschooling. The second one is blurred lines, the rise of the new gender neutral generation. There's a huge movement now towards grow your own, creating your own vegetable gardens, and then a trend towards disconnecting where people are beginning to move off-grid and indulge in self-building projects. So all of these combined, along with all my consumer profiles that I've identified and already discussed, where we've got the high style mum, the hipster mum, the new earth mum, and the working mum, I create into a summary and evaluation. So with all my trend publications, I always start with an introduction where I summarise my pastel analysis for each season. In my Autumn-Winter 18-19 magazine, I analysed this by saying, all the trends in this publication draw inspiration from our ever-changing world and all the pastel influences that are taking place currently. Society in general has become divided by huge shifts in politics, leaving people either satisfied or deeply unsatisfied with the way things are developing and how we visualise the future. These changes have prompted people to turn away from, or even retreat from, current affairs and seek a deeper meaning to life. People are taking sanctuary in finding a more simplistic lifestyle, downsizing, home-growing, homeschooling, travelling, self-building, exploring and taking an interest into the past to find a deeper understanding of how we got to where we are today and to create a more optimistic outlook for the future. Parents and guardians are seeking an alternative family life away from the mainstream in hope of bringing up a more optimistic, less complicated generation unaffected by today's perhaps less positive lifestyles. There is an overwhelming feeling that the structure of government and the rules that are implemented on us as individuals are never going to satisfy all. This is increasingly the case and somewhat result of the huge population on Earth that is far greater than a few generations back. There is the distinctive feeling that things need to change and not everybody is adapted for society as it is today. Mainstream education, for example, is one thing that doesn't serve each child equally, prompting parents to seek alternatives like homeschooling and forest schools to more deeply satisfy their children's individual needs. All these scenarios have influenced this season's trends and represent the diversity in society and the one thing that unites all individuals, which is to create a better future for our young. All this information I have translated into various different trend stories. Farmers market, intergalactic, homeschool, mountain yurt, and finally prehistoric. Farmers market celebrates grow your own trends in organic produce and the rise in allotment community gardens. Intergalactic takes inspiration from recent space discoveries and the huge focus on the British astronaut Tim Peake. Homeschool draws inspiration from the trend in homeschooling and alternative education methods such as forest schools. Mountain yurt looks at the increasing trend to live off-grid and away from mainstream society, living a more sustainable lifestyle. And finally, prehistoric plays on one's intrigue to understand our past and the increasing discoveries from the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. So you can see I've taken all the information from my pastel research and bear in mind my consumer profiles and come up with these 5 trend stories. So here is one of the trend boards from the Autumn-Winter 19 publication titled Farmers Market. This has drawn inspiration from the consumer profile New Earth Mum, along with all the information from my pastel, including the Grow Your Own, and has formed me to develop one trend story called Farmers Market. Remember also, in the first lesson, we looked at the WGSM presentation, where they noticed that there was going to be an increased amount of tourism moving to Cuba. The sector is expected to boom further over the coming years, giving easing US restrictions on travel, the return of the US cruise ships to the Caribbean island, and regular commercial flights between the two countries. They translated this into lots of visual information, all of which they narrowed down and created lots of trend boards, including this one, Casual Cuba. Identifying your trends and start building an image collective. Moving from macro to micro research, where do you start? So we're aware of what the macro environmental research is, we've done our pastel, and we're aware that from the micro research, we look at things more closely of how it will affect our own consumer profiles. A forecaster can take information from their macro pastel analysis and develop it for their micro market to figure out how this information will affect their target market, their consumer profiles. This allows them to delve deeper into relevant topics and channel their research into useful trend predictions. So what should you do next? The main thing when you're researching and developing trends is to gather, analyse and visualise. So what? I'm gathering what? Information from trade shows, catwalk reports, market intelligence, stuff you find interesting, and your pastel analysis obviously. So all of this is combined with what we've done so far in the first few lessons. And where from? We'll come onto this a bit more later on, but blogs and websites, newspapers, style fashion publications, exhibitions and new books and movies. Get out there and basically start looking. Analyse. Make sense of everything that you've gathered. Think, how can I build on all this information into a clear direction? Think, how can this be translated for the target market? Use your intuition, but ground it with solid research. Then visualise, and again we'll look at this in a future lesson, putting it together in an informative and inspirational way. Think about the images you collect. Is this image really saying what you want it to say? Is the text short, sharp and accurate? Again, we'll look at this more depth later on. Pastel analysis. Look at your pastel as a whole. What are the key stories and events that you think will have the most effect upon your consumer profiles? How do you think these events may evolve or develop over the next 18 months or further? How might your target consumers react to these events? Identify 3 times trend stories that you can pull from this information. So what's next? Start compiling a digital image collective for each of your 3 trends. Remember, keep your research broad. If your research is too narrow, not enough inspirational imagery, you'll find it hard to combine a successful trend story. A trend forecaster will narrow the images on their trend boards down from hundreds, even thousands of images. Start searching for conceptual images that build up an image visually of your trend stories. You're trying to find images that get across your story visually, basically. Keep track of where you find your images. You will need to credit them all. Use tools such as Pinterest to help with this. That way you can always trace the URL of each image. Common mistakes. Remember, your trend board should be built up of predominantly conceptual imagery, not current images of fashion or catwalk images. What do we mean by conceptual imagery? The overall definition is the cognitive symbolization of ideas or unions based upon ideas. Okay, so that's a little hard to digest, so let's look at that in a bit more detail. So here is a selection of conceptual imageries here on the left, as well as secondary resource imagery of catwalks on the right. Although the images on the right, you might use one of them within a trend story, but you can see as they build up, they kind of give a real dark feeling. So really you'd want to cut them out or try and find them from a fashion shoot. Whereas the conceptual images on the left really help to sort of build up a trend story. They're a lot more clear. So what you want to do is go onto something like Pinterest, maybe create a board for your season, and then start saving and pinning lots of images to it. Think about all your trend stories. Think about what images on the net you can search for that might describe these stories, and build up a colour palette and create a union between them. You then want to filter all the images down before they go onto your trend board. So like I said, you should hopefully have hundreds, possibly thousands of images to filter down from. Here are all the images perhaps that I found for one of my trend boards. You can see there's lots of them. I start collecting them all, but then gradually obviously there's too many. And then what I want to do is filter them down to create the trend story. Here you can see I start to build the trend up, looking at what images work best describe my trend, and there's a union and synergy forming between a colour palette. There's nothing here that contrasts too much against one another. And then finally, I've added my trend name, a slight description, and colour palettes. We'll come more onto that in a future lesson. So where should I be researching for this imagery? Obviously, it's not just going to pounce that at you. You should be researching blogs, magazines, perhaps exhibitions, looking at competitors. Pinterest and Tumblr have a great collection of images as long as you're willing to search, as well as your own images and even your street style shots, basically anywhere and everywhere. And what should the outcome of these trend boards be? A designer or buyer should be able to design or build a fashion range from the inspiration on your trend boards. Make sure your images build up a tight colour palette. Make sure you give ideas for shape, texture and print. So where should I be researching for this imagery? Obviously, it's not just going to pounce that at you. You should be researching blogs, magazines, perhaps exhibitions, looking at competitors. Pinterest and Tumblr have a great collection of images as long as you're willing to search, as well as your own images and even your street style shots, basically anywhere and everywhere. And what should the outcome of these trend boards be? A designer or buyer should be able to design or build a fashion range from the inspiration on your trend boards. Make sure your images build up a tight colour palette. Make sure you give ideas for shape, texture and print. Here you can see a trend board that I created for a specific client, Teddy Smith. As well as the overall mood and trend feel, I've given a separate board which describes the prints and graphics I'd like to use within the collection. Again, we'll look into more detail about the different stages of trend in the next lesson. And here you can see how it's translated into a fashion range. Altogether, you can see it all fits together. There's no new colours that I've added within the range that don't appear within the colour palette, and it all represents the whole story. That's what you want to try and achieve from your trend boards. Here is another client-based trend story that I've come up with, and again you can see how the fashion range that I've created from it corresponds with it. And again, another one. Task. This week, identify your 3 trend stories and their titles. Start compiling a digital image collective from each of them. Remember all the places that you can use to find these images, and make sure that each image is really describing what you want your trend story to tell. Further reading.